Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us from all across the country. My name is Denise Dodor, and I am a reporter at KABC TV here in Los Angeles. I feel very close to what we're going to be talking about tonight. My stepfather, Lane Hirabayashi, was the premier chair at UCLA for he was an anthropologist and a scholar, and he was the premier chair for the George and Sakai Aratani Professor of the Japanese American incarceration studies there. And my mom, too, is also an Asian American studies scholar. So between the two of them, I have been able to just appreciate how important it is to keep talking about history, because history is alive and well, and it just keeps repeating itself. And that's why we're here today, and we're doing it virtually, because I know that many of you have gone on these pilgrimages, and that is so wonderful, but I'm glad that we can still do this virtually. Today, our topic is, and I have to wear my glasses, the Japanese American newspapers before, during, and after World War II, and civil rights activist Sei Fujii. Our panelists are Jeffrey G. Chin, Brian Niiya, Ellen Endo, Bill Watanabe. I'll give you a little bit of a description here. Japanese American periodicals have played a critical role in informing and representing the community before, during, and after World War II, in times when the Nikkei community was silenced by racially biased laws and incarceration. Periodicals provided the opportunity to have their voices heard, sort of the Facebook groups of today and social media. This was the OG of all that. The program explores the nuances of this representation and the role of the press back then, as well as its impact today. We have selected discussion topics: the life and legacy of Sei Fujii, Issei, civil rights activist and founder of the bilingual Kashu Mainichi, the Japanese California Daily News. And let me introduce our panelists right now, without further ado. Well, this panel is a Tadaima 2021 program by the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, hosted by the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California. It's a collaboration with board members of the Little Tokyo Historical Society. Great work that you're doing, keeping history alive. Brian Niiya is the editor of the online Densho Encyclopedia and has held various positions with UCLA Asian American Studies Center, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii that have involved managing collections, curating exhibitions, developing public programs, and producing videos, books, and websites. He has published many articles on Japanese American history in a variety of academic and mainstream publications. And I took a look at that website. Wow, it is very, very intense. It has a lot of information, so I'm sure you've all seen it. Ellen Endo is a lifelong journalist and former senior level executive in the motion picture and television industry. She's also a community volunteer, serving as Little Tokyo Business Association president and board member with the Little Tokyo Community Council, Friends of Manzanar, and Arts District Little Tokyo Neighborhood Council. We're so glad to have your insight here tonight. Community advocate Bill Watanabe really doesn't need an introduction at all. He is the founding executive director of the Little Tokyo Service Center and founder of the Little Tokyo Historical Society based in Los Angeles. And last but not least, publisher Jeffrey G. Chin is a feature film director. His works have been presented at the Walt Disney Family Museum and ABC's Good Morning America, and he's best known for his award-winning short, Little Tokyo Reporter, on civil rights leader Sei Fujii. Jeffrey is also a protege of the late John Singleton. So love all the work you've done so far, and we're expecting great, even more important things from you. Let's start off with the first question. In early JA society, what role did the community periodicals play for the community, and how was each paper unique? Who wants to take that first?
I can take that. I'm probably the oldest one on the panel, but that's okay. I know history. It's interesting because a lot of the early immigrants that came over around 1868 were unemployed samurai, because the Meiji era brought modernization to Japan, and then the samurai became obsolete, and they traveled to as immigrants to Hawaii first, and then of course to the West Coast. But one of the things that samurai were educated, so it was natural for them to want to communicate with each other, and newspapers became a natural sort of vehicle for this kind of communication. So by the 20th century, there were about 25,000 Issei, Japanese, those first generation Japanese living in the United States. They helped build the railroads, they worked on farms, they shoveled coal, they got married, they started families. And the first newspapers were established around 1895 by these immigrants who came to America as students. Some of them were students, or they were called schoolboys, and most of the people were organized by these students. A lot of the newspapers came and went. They were around for a short while and they disappeared. But a few stuck around, and including some that are still around. So in 1899, a businessman named Kyotaro Abiko started the Nichibei Shimbun. That was a publication that went through several incarnations and still kind of exists today as the Nichibei Weekly in Northern California. I think some of you who are here from San Francisco will know the Nichibei Times. The Hokubei Jiji came on in 1902, and that still exists today as the North American Post. It's a weekly now as well. It's based in Seattle. And then in 1903, the following year, the Rafushinpo was founded, and founded by 3 USC students. They were, of course, those schoolboys I was telling you about. And now the Rafushinpo is in its 118th year. It's still a daily, although it's 3 days a week. It went to 3 days a week because of COVID, because of the pandemic, and I think eventually they're going to go back to 4 days a week. But I think that'll be kind of where they stay for a while. So each of these newspapers had different constituencies. Some were aimed toward rural families, some were aimed toward businessmen, and some were predominantly Buddhist in terms of their readership. Some were predominantly Christian, but each one had their thing. And there also were people who subscribed to newspapers because the publisher, the editor, the writers were from the same part of Japan that they were from. So there were lots of different reasons and lots of different newspapers. The picture you see, that's how they got the paper. It wasn't mailed or sent by the internet. It was posted on a local site, and people would just know where to go, and they go read the news for the day. Most of the news was about what was happening in Japan. So they later on they realized that a lot of people were interested in what was going on in the United States in the Japanese communities, and so that became kind of a thing. So that's kind of the role that they played, and they've been playing that role ever since. And it's a kind of a phenomenon, but like I said, we started at one point. There were 29 newspapers in the Japanese American newspapers in the United States, Canada, Peru, Brazil, all outside of Japan. And today there are 6. So we're hanging in there. That's all I can say. Thanks.
Sorry, I got to be quicker to unmute there. But there was competition between these different newspapers, right, Ellen? And how did that generate interest? And what was the interplay between them?
You want to unmute Ellen?
I can do it myself. Okay. Yeah, there was competition. The height of it was actually something I was involved in. And actually most families subscribe to, there were several papers, but most subscribe to at least 2 of the 5 newspapers. So, but in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, I was working at Rafushinpo, and I had a column, and we started to publicize the third generation, the Sansei unrest. They were questioning why they were just hearing about the camps, why nobody complained, why the Nisei were so quiet about it, and the Issei were just angry. They were just angry. And so I started to write about that. But meanwhile, about a few blocks away is the office of Kashi Mainichi. And Kashi Mainichi had a columnist whose name was George Yoshinaga. And George had a whole different view. He was in camp. He was a teenager. He had fun. He actually redid his senior year so he could play sports, so he could stay in high school and play sports in camp. And so he had a whole different view. And until his death, I guess was it last year, he maintained that the camps weren't that bad. So obviously we had this back and forth, but you couldn't tell, you didn't know what I was writing about unless you subscribed to Kashi Mainichi, and you didn't know what he was talking about unless you subscribed to Rafu Shimpo. So we increased, so this competition in fact increased both our subscriptions, readership, until I don't know what Kashi Mainichi's was, but at the height, it was the most we've ever had, 25,000 subscribers. We've never reached that number since, but everybody loves to watch a fight, I guess.
Interesting. And then Jeffrey, I guess competition played a role in getting Issei Sei Fujii onto the scene.
Yeah, so it's funny because Ellen was talking about a few of these schoolboys that went to USC. So actually, Sei Fujii also attended USC before he immigrated. He's also from samurai heritage. He lived as a houseboy for the Ralph's family, allegedly, and then he also went to Compton Union High School. And so when he went to USC, he studied law, but it was against the law for him to practice or to be able to get a license because he was a non-citizen. So he utilized the newspaper as a tool to reach out to the community. And his following specifically was a lot of labor class and farmers. And, when certain things impacted the working class community, he was a rabble rouser, and he would often speak out about the gambling dens or speak out against other newspapers. And that caused a lot of conflicts and cases where immigration wanted to deport him and attempts on his life. And so leading up into the war, definitely he was a very controversial publisher, but he was also using this as a platform to sort of begin the movement of what, along with many other Japanese Americans, of what would be sort of civil rights and getting equal rights for the community. Here on this lawn picture, he has a collection of newspapers. And so a lot of these early news publishers, they would collect newspapers from all across the United States, listen to both national and international radio programs, and compile their own updates for the communities. This also caught the attention of the government leading up to the war. And so I think we have some images of what happens next. So yeah, Sei Fujii used his newspaper as a tool to reach out to the community. He also had opportunities to build race relations with other communities, including Latinos, Filipinos, Chinese. He helped with farm labor unions, and he also ran a radio program where he would host guests, including different members, young students, as well as the Nisei Week Court.
Would you say he was quite the celebrity of his time, or did he also make a lot of enemies?
Since he was such an outspoken individual, he made both many friends and many enemies, and he happened to have a very complex personal life. Many Issei had complex personal lives, but it was hard to find a single woman, so he ended up being attracted to sometimes married women. So outside of his newspapers, he had both friends and enemies. So
Yes, he was quite the looker in that long picture. I mean, he had incredible hair, very, very handsome. But he was also very dedicated in helping his community, and he really was seeking fairness throughout most of his life. Um, so he was part of many publishers, well, at least four primary ones. So he was part of the Gang of Four. Maybe we could talk about who were the Gang of Four, what were their roles in society, and why did they get placed into camp together?
Do you want me? Do you want to take that or?
I'll go ahead and start that. And like,
Okay.
I'll follow.
The Gang of Four. The Gang of Four very simply were Sei Fujii, of course, a newspaper man. H.T. Komai, who was the publisher of the Rafushinpo. Yamon Minami, who was known as the Lettuce King of California, and quite wealthy. And Katsuma Mukaida, who was like Fujii, trained as an attorney but not allowed to practice. But up until his death, he was very active in the Japanese American community. Maybe Bill knows more about Mukaida.
Yeah, I can only add a little bit. Certainly not an expert in this field, and I'm sure Brian and Ellen, you and Jeff know much more than I do. But we put this label Gang of Four. Of course, that's not what they were called back then. And they ended up being in the same camp in Santa Fe, mainly because they were community leaders. And the FBI just assumed that if you're an active community leader, that alone made you suspicious. And so that's, when they were arrested, eventually they ended up at Santa Fe. Mr. Mukaida, the gentleman on the left, he was a very active person in the community. He did get a law degree, but he couldn't practice law like Sei Fujii. And it always made me kind of inspired to learn that these people studied law. And I think in the back of their minds, even though they knew they couldn't practice law, it would allow them to understand how things work and could actually work against racist and unjust laws. So Mr. Mukaida was very active in the trying to bridge like educational institutions to the Japanese American community. When he was in Santa Fe, the very famous African American attorney Hugh Macbeth wrote several letters to try to see if he can get him released from prison. When in 1952, when they passed the allowed Japanese and others to become naturalized citizens, Mr. Mukaida was a champion of that and helped to get the laws passed to do that. And he and another early Japanese attorney, Gongoro Nakamura, were the first two in Los Angeles to become naturalized US citizens. Mr. Minami, the Minami family is very well known in the Japanese American community because he became one of the big farmers in the San Joaquin Valley. As Ellen mentioned, he got the label the Lettuce King. And so his family is still very active in the Santa Maria area. And Mr. Minami contributed to many Japanese and Japanese American organizations, which I suppose that alone made him suspicious to the government. And Mr. Komai, of course, he is the son of the founder of the Rafushinpo. And after the war, he became very active also in the community to try to help with the resettlement. He was a very strong advocate of youth programs and sports programs. And then on the far right was Mr. Sei Fujii, who we've already mentioned has been a publisher and was very active fighting for the civil rights of Japanese American. And I'm so glad that people like Jeffrey Chin has made a film about this, and now we're coming out with a book, because people need to know that these people were so active, stepping out even when it meant problems for their own lives, to speak out for the community.
Did we answer the question of how the four of them ended up in the same camp?
You know, I don't know the journeys each,
Um,
and perhaps Brian could address that. But my guess is because they were active leaders. They were all active leaders. They were all rounded up by the FBI, and that's where they ended up.
So Brian, maybe you could talk about how these newspapers changed when they were in camp. How did the messaging shift?
Sure, yeah, I'll try to cover the World War II years. First of all, with regard to how they ended up in the same camp, Santa Fe sort of ended up being the main long-term internment camp. So a lot of the Issei leaders who remained in the Justice Department system who weren't paroled to WRA camps ended up at Santa Fe. There were a lot of journalists there, not just Fujii and Komai, but many others, including from Hawaii. Not surprisingly, there was a newspaper there as well as at Lordsburg and Crystal City. But anyway, as has been covered, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, these community leaders were rounded up, including most of the major journalists in the Japanese American community. My grandfather was one of those. He was the managing editor of the Nikkei in Honolulu, which is one of the two main Japanese papers there. There were also some, and it was primarily those who edited the Japanese sections, though a few English language editors were also rounded up. Famously, Togo Tanaka, who was the English language editor of the Rafushimpo, was arrested and briefly detained. They let him go after like 11 days, I think. But the papers were allowed to keep operating under supervision until the roundup. So the Rafushimpo, the Nichibe, and so on, keep publishing into the spring until they have to shut down when all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast are forcibly incarcerated. As I'm sure this audience knows, there were inmate-run newspapers at all of the so-called assembly centers and War Relocation Authority administered concentration camps. I just picked a couple at random. This is the one from Tanforan, Totalizer, and you can go to the next slide and see what one in the WRA camps, the Manzanar Free Press. You can see that the WRA papers were kind of nicer, fancier. Manzanar was one of 3 of the WRA camps that had a printed newspaper as opposed to mimeograph. But when you look at them, they have kind of the appearance of a typical small town newspaper, right? With sports results, social calendars, church listings. The administration used them to pass notices to the community. But of course they weren't, right? They were newspapers in concentration camps. So even though they were edited by Japanese Americans, they were not sort of free press, despite the name Free Press, and somewhat ironically of the Manzanar paper. The Assembly Center papers were in English only, and in all the Assembly Centers but one had a paper, and they were overtly censored by the administration. The editors had to get their text approved before the paper came out. When Japanese Americans moved to the War Relocation Authority camps, they were not explicitly or overtly censored in the same way, but they were still kind of controlled by the administration, right? So mainly by kind of appointing only editors and staff who were known to be more cooperative. Not, you don't have dissidents who are in that role in the newspapers in the WRA camps. And there were some examples of, actually, not the slide yet, sorry. There were certain examples of more overt control. A couple examples being at Manzanar, where there was the riot, quote unquote, uprising December of '42. The Free Press just shut down. There was no newspaper for like 20 days. And then when the first issue of the paper appeared on Christmas Day, December 25, there was no mention of any of the events of earlier in the month. At Minidoka, there was a controversy about the fence, right? Many of the camps, the fence is built after the inmates arrive, and that causes a lot of concern and some unrest, including at Minidoka. But at Minidoka, the reports officer basically instructed the staff not to print anything about the fence, and no editorializing about the fence. So you had situations like that as well. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. But in addition to the papers in the that were produced in the camps, and I should mention all of these are available online on Densho's website. You can get copies of all of the camp newspapers, and it's elsewhere. They are elsewhere as well. But there are also, because not all Japanese Americans, only Japanese Americans on the West Coast were incarcerated, those inland were allowed to remain outside. There were 4 outpapers that were published during the war outside of the camps. 2 in Colorado, out of Denver, the Rocky Shimpo and the Colorado Times, and 2 in Salt Lake City, the Utah Nippo and the Pacific Citizen. And all of them saw their circulations rise during the war because people in the camp subscribed to these outside papers, believing that they were more, they presented a more unfettered view of what was going on the outside, right? Feeling they didn't feel like they could trust the papers that were produced in the camps. Couple of notable things about these papers. Under the editorship of James Omura, the Rocky Shimpo famously supported the Heart Mountain draft resistance cases. Kind of courageously. It ended up getting Omura arrested, and in direct contradiction or direct opposition to the editorial line of the Heart Mountain Free Press, which is a camp paper. And you go to the next slide. The Pacific Citizen, which was the Japanese American Citizens League paper edited by Larry Tajiri, heavily assisted by his wife Guyo. Although they were a JCL paper, they aspired to be a kind of a national Japanese American paper. And I feel like kind of we're able to operate somewhat independently from the JCL and I think remain a useful source even today. And again, the entire run of the Pacific Citizen is online on Densho's site and on the Pacific Citizen site, which still exists. And just a quick word on Hawaii. Under martial law, the Hawaii newspapers were allowed to, the 2 main Hawaii newspapers in Honolulu were allowed to continue publication under martial law, but under the supervision of the military government, which used them as a means to keep the Japanese American population, particularly the Issei, there informed. So that's kind of a quick overview of what happened during the war years and the roles of the newspapers in that time period.
So Brian, I am amazed by how intricate and full ranging these papers are. How were they able to write all this? How were they able to communicate? And how come the government didn't shut them down?
You're talking about the outside papers.
Oh, the outside papers, and then there were papers inside.
Yeah, in the camps, yeah. The ones in the camps were, I mean, they were given offices and they were given, supplies, typewriters, mimeograph machines. The staff were paid by the WRA, by the administration. So they were full-fledged, newspapers, albeit, as I mentioned, kind of controlled by the administration, though maybe not overtly censored. The outside papers operated like, papers before the war and after the war, right? They're supported by their subscribers and so forth. So many of them were and these were much smaller operations. These weren't, in Colorado and Salt Lake City, these aren't LA or San Francisco. So these are very small papers. But as I mentioned, their circulations really grew during the war because there was this greater demand, not just from people in camp, but also as people left the camp and resettled in the Chicagos and New York, they also subscribed to these papers.
Jeffrey and I were having a discussion about these papers. Not only were they important for people to know what was going on in the community, inside, outside the camps, but it was also important in building, I guess, pride, community pride, because of, how they were considered enemies in their own land. And so this was really important in making them feel, I don't know, included in society.
Yeah, one thing that I found really fascinating, and sort of going back to the Gang of Four, and you could probably say the gang of a bunch of people who ended up in Santa Fe, was that, probably not only did Sei Fujii make a bunch of enemies before the war, whether it's fighting with the newspapers or being an outspoken leader that sometimes with controversial subjects, all these guys ended up, or majority of them ended up in Santa Fe together. And they ended up having to form the Santa Fe Times. And I believe that was 31 newspaper reporters that they all came together to form that Santa Fe Times. And so it became more about, rather than what their differences were or who their followers were, but about finding a way to empower the community during these hard times. So like when I was talking to Brian, because Brian's like an all-star with all this research, I was just, I don't know, I have endless questions about, you know, how they utilize the newspaper to try to empower the youth in camp, or, you know, how to empower the community during that hard time when they're being called enemy alien.
That is some heavy stuff. And I mean, I'm glad the newspapers were there. Is it time? Do we have any questions? Do we want to move on to the post-war? What happened to these periodicals after the war? I think we have a few minutes if there's anyone in the audience. I know somebody asked about Isamu Noguchi. Was he involved with the press at all, Jeffrey? I know you were typing up an answer for Grace.
The name was familiar, but
No,
it didn't
yeah.
correlate. Ellen knows.
Actually, yeah, Isamu Noguchi was quite the artist. He's obviously a well-known sculptor who I think they still have a gallery, museum of his work in New York. And he also created the plaza in Los Angeles at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. But he was quite the writer. I have read his work he did do some writing about the camps in general. Because he was on the East Coast, he was not to evacuation, but he volunteered to go into the camps. He actually designed what he thought would be a livable camp, and it had like a mini golf site, and it had a lot of different amenities that, of course, were not implemented as far as the actual camps were concerned. But he was he thought a lot about it. He talked about. He was very intellectual in his approach. But if you can probably find it online. If you do find some of his written work online, I encourage everybody to check it out.
And as far as I know, as far as I know, he didn't have any specific involvement with the JA Press, although in the 50s he became was covered a lot in the Japanese American press, especially when he married Shirley Yamaguchi, the famous movie star, and they became quite the Nisei glamour couple, even though neither of them were really Nisei, but that's a whole other story.
Fascinating, but I bet we could read about him in the Densho Encyclopedia, right, Brian?
You can, yes.
Of course. All right, so let's talk about post-war. What happened to the periodicals after the war? Where did most of them crop up?
Started, and Brian, you can fill in. Most of them started back up, but not all of them, but most of them started up around in 1946. The war ended in 1945, around fall, August, and so people started to return to the cities where they originated, and so most of the papers actually started up again. A lot of them had like in the case of the Rafashimpo, had been continued to pay the rent on the building that they were occupying. There's a famous, people thought it was an urban legend, but it's true, the famous story about how the publisher, the Issei, the son of the original publisher, hid the Japanese type under the floorboards of the building. And the reason he continued to pay rent is because he knew that it was like having a buried treasure. He knew that the treasure was under the floorboard. And I'm going to read an excerpt from his diary. This is from the diary of Akira Komai, April 6, 1942. What a day. We take the boxes of Japanese type clean and wrap them, and store them systematically down in the cellar beneath the floorboards. We can see the shadows of men circling the building, looking into windows, trying to see what they're doing inside. Suddenly, a water pipe breaks and dang near floods the whole cellar. We managed to turn the water off and get down to work. Tuesday, April 7th, 1942. Today, we cleaned up most of Rafujimpo. At least we finally managed to secure all the type downstairs in the cellar. The workers finished early, and they left the place. They left. The place seemed so lonely. So and then when they came back, that was the idea was that they would be able to resume, and they did. They were the first to resume publication January 1st, 1946.
So this print is more precious than gold.
Yes.
And then I would add that in addition to the papers that reopened on the West Coast, there were many new papers that started in these kind of new resettlement communities, right? Because as you know, out of the camps, many Japanese Americans were not allowed to return to the West Coast until 1945, and they left for places on inland, right? Chicago probably became the biggest destination, but Denver, New York, Minnesota, all over the country. And new newspapers inevitably were founded in these new communities. The Chicago Shimpo was one of the prominent ones. The Nisei Weekender out of New York was one. Here, Crossroads was in LA. And an interesting development is, as opposed to the pre-war era, you started to have some English-only newspapers that were purely Nisei, Crossroads being one of them. And just as an aside, with Crossroads, as far as I know, there is no full collection of this newspaper in any archive. So, you know, we would love to be able to scan these and put them online, because I think it's a really valuable resource, and it doesn't exist. So if anybody out there knows where there is a collection of these, it would be great. All the issues I see of Crossroads seem to have like attractive women featured on the front page. That seemed to be, you know, a marketing strategy of some sort. But anyway, so that's the other side of the story. In addition to the ones restarting on the West Coast, there were all these new newspapers that started in these new Japanese American communities that formed after the war. Many of those papers were short-lived. Crossroads lasted a little over 25 years, I think.
Huh. That's a long time. What role did the periodicals play in shifting the understanding and the discussion with the trauma from World War II incarceration? And who was Edison Uno?
And I could take that if no one else. I mean, Ellen was there, a participant, so I think you should.
Oh, well, yeah, actually Edison was the reason the Rafujimpo started publishing letters to the editor. I think it was his letter that we published in the English section, and then Japanese section translated it. And a lot of our readers got very angry because they didn't want the camp experience to be discussed at all. A lot of them. So Edison was one of the leaders. I think he was active in JCL at the time. What was interesting about him is that he was his family, the males in the family, had this genetic disorder, and most of them knew they wouldn't live past 40. And so he dedicated whatever time he had to, you know, advancing this the awareness of the camps, and that's the Edison I knew. He was quite a guy, and actually when the newspaper was created, Ghidra was created out of the Asian American movement, and I guess it was the late 60s, early 70s. Maybe Bill knows.
1969 it started.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they took on a lot of issues. I mean, there was the Vietnam War and civil rights and Asian American studies, the lack of, so they took on a lot of the issues. I kind of represent, I was, they didn't realize maybe, but I was the same age as the people who started Ghidra. so they, but they saw me as part of the establishment because, I was working for Ralph Shimpo and had been for, at that point, maybe 10 years. So they, so you'll find my name in in Ghidra if you get your hands on a copy occasionally where they disagreed with what I was writing, but it was okay. I still appreciate what they were trying to accomplish.
Ellen, you are very, very brave. We're grateful for your voice. So these periodicals were also used directly after the war to overturn the California alien land law, and Sei Fujii was a very big part of that. And maybe Jeffrey, you could tell us more about that.
I think the periodicals helped inform the community about a lot of activities that were going on right after the war. And so one of the sort of landmark cases that spread around the community was the Oyama versus California case, which was basically to prove that if the son of a Japanese immigrant who's born on American soil, if they could own land. And so that case started, I think Brian could confirm this. I think that was like 1920s original Oyama case. And then it was finally settled up closer to 1940s. But basically with that case being won, Sei Fujii wanted to prove that Japanese who were not citizens, because they had only recently had the ability to become citizens, and this was pre-1965. And so he wanted to prove in California Supreme Court that non-citizens and people who are ineligible for citizenship could own land. And so he contested the case. So immediately after being released from camp in 1946, he went to search for property and immediately broke the law to go buy property under his name. And he won the landmark case. And so, these years, 1952 and then leading up into the 60s, where, Ellen was talking about the way that the community started reflecting on what it means to be American, what their rights are. I think it really built into a larger conversation of being involved with civil rights. So.
Sorry, trying to unmute there. Definitely impressive. He was not afraid to just go straight ahead against the government and prove something that was definitely so unfair. He knew it. Everyone knew that. But you all, let's talk a little bit about what you've done. He wasn't even able to become a lawyer, or at least a legal lawyer. But you were able to, I guess, post in his death, fix that.
Yeah, so one of the activities we've done with the Little Tokyo Historical Society, and special shout out to Bill for founding our organization, was that we've been able to right some wrongs in the history of, Sei Fujii's life, as well as some other community leaders. And with Sei Fujii, we were able to do the Little Tokyo Reporter short film. We built a memorial lantern designed by Miles Endo, whose grandfather or great-grandfather was in Santa Fe in a picture with Sei Fujii. It's Kenny Endo's son, Miles Endo. And then we also were able to get through Kristen Hayashi and Maiko Kimura, we were able to get the historic designation of the Japanese hospital, which was a hospital that was built in response to the 1918 flu epidemic. And Sei Fujii, along with his classmate, J. Marion Wright, traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. to help fight to build a hospital in Boyle Heights for the community in Los Angeles. And so that got historic designation. And then through the help of JABA and Sydney Kanazawa, we were able to get a posthumous law license. So Sei Fujii is the first Japanese American to get a posthumous law license in California. And so we've been really lucky to keep on promoting his story, thinking about, not just him singularly, but how his experience as an Issei, as an immigrant, represents this broader scope of fearlessness that first generation had, and the conversations and ways that they could communicate to their community. And so Sei Fujii was not able to practice law, so he worked as a legal consultant. He helped with unions. He worked with Hugh Macbeth, who's the prominent Black attorney whose son ended up helping work on redress cases. And they traveled across California for 6 years leading up to World War II, trying to help build race relations. And so you have these very active community and civil rights leaders that their stories have not been told. And, I think that's part of the beauty of this research that we've been doing on these early newspapers. It's just simply an honor to be part of this process.
I would like to just add that, I've worked in Little Tokyo for over 30, 35 years. And during that time, I never heard of Sei Fujii. I had no knowledge of who he was until we started the Little Tokyo Historical Society. And as Jeffrey mentioned, we started to learn about this man, and we thought, oh my gosh, how could we allow this person to be forgotten like this? Even though he was a newspaper publisher, and he had done all these things, somehow he just sort of became forgotten. And so I think the film that Jeffrey did, we now have a memorial in Little Tokyo, and the fact that we're talking about him right now is so important, that we don't allow these people who were fearless. I mean, he was almost murdered by gangsters when he was publishing some articles in his newspaper. And so it took a lot of courage and guts to do what these people did when they did it. And so we really can't allow that to be forgotten. And so I'm so glad that we're talking about him today, and just the role of newspapers and how important they were in the community at the time.
Yeah, and actually the reason why Kashi Mainichi was founded was in direct response to this immigration smuggling ring where Japanese were coming over Mexican border, and there were some both immigration officers, but then also opportunistic people in the community who were basically turning in their own people. And Sei Fujii, he didn't have his newspaper during this time, but he started publishing and working with other reporters to try to rally the community. And he ends up having this big town hall meeting with over 1,400 farmers. The immigration officer comes in and tries to oust him, and Sei Fujii pretends to translate for him. He said, come up to the front, and he pretends to translate for them. But he explains that this immigration officer comes at night and demands bribe money in order for you to stay here. And there was a huge riot, which ended up this immigration officer losing his role. Some of these corrupt people who were turning in their own people were ousted as well and tossed into jail. But as a result, these working class Japanese immigrants helped fund the Kashi Mainichi along with the Yamaguchi Kenjinkai.
So we are running a little behind here because this has been fascinating, and I think that we are definitely piquing people's interest. Maybe we should move on to closing remarks from all of our panelists so that we have enough time to open it up to questions. And there are quite a few questions on the chat. So maybe Ellen, you can start. How have community newspapers been impacted today, and do they hold a larger responsibility to represent the JA community than ever before?
Yes, I think one thing we learned oddly during the pandemic was how important the newspaper is to connect, because while we're always struggling at the Rafushimpo. I mean, most newspapers do. They live hand to mouth. But what happened was our online presence became bigger. Our Facebook followers became more, and so I think so. But the responsibility of that really was not missed by our editor Gwen Muranaka and publisher Michael Komai, and we really have tried to adhere to journalistic principles and to, find, work a little harder to find those stories that are genuinely newsworthy and important to the community. So yes, but like I said, it was odd that the pandemic is what sparked that return to journalistic principles in our staff.
Brian, if you can give us some closing remarks about these newspapers and the impact and where we're heading.
It's a good question. I mean, I know it's been a very tough time for like all newspapers, right? Just the rise of the internet, and and the Japanese American papers are faced with this double problem just because of the shrinking community base. So yeah, it's a tough time, but there are a handful of these papers that are still around. We should really support them. They still play a really important role in our community, and the Rakushimpo, the Hawaii Herald, the Nikkei Weekly, the Pacific Citizen. I mean, they're still around, and they deserve our support. So I hope they do survive and to the next generation.
Bill, I imagine programs like this is how we're going to keep them alive. We have to keep talking about the impact. And how do you think you're going to get the young people on board? That's how they're going to keep these alive.
Yeah, that is probably the big challenge. I think back when newspapers were using mimeograph, and that was the technology, I guess, of the day. And so there has to be adaptation. And newspapers like the Rakushimpo, they're also like a newsletter. They don't just publish the news, but they're like a glue that helps to keep the community informed. And I think people are becoming aware, even younger people. I paid a subscription for my daughter. I mean, I don't know if she reads it, but I want her to be connected, because the more she learns about the community and the history and what people are doing, that helps to keep that glue intact so that the community continues to have its history, its identity, and its culture preserved.
And Jeffrey, I know you just love learning about the past and bringing it to us in living color, but what do these papers mean to you, and where do you see them going from here?
Well, I hope they continue to being, active part in the community. I think, it's been a challenge with these past 2 years to miss out on all the community events. And, yes, we have social media, but it's really nice to have the papers to honor people who are doing things in the community and to create the conversations that are necessary. I think it's a challenge, right? Because you have many different formats and how we communicate, but ultimately, we have time-tested formats that can be very proud about. So, I'm happy to be part of this legacy. Also, Ellen, I'm going to pitch Ellen's project real quick, and then I was going to pitch our book. But Ellen has this wonderful documentary coming out soon called Paper Chase, which is going to be focusing on JA newspapers. And I just wanted to hear briefly about that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. But yeah, the Zentoku Foundation we received a grant from UCLA Asian American Studies, the Aratani Care program. And we put together a documentary which follows Japanese American history as seen through the lens of these newspapers. And so we were lucky enough to find footage that has never been seen before, or if it was seen, then it was buried. So we have like the footage from Hawaii, from the Japanese frolicking in Hawaii in 1906, and we have a lot of other kind of interesting little vignettes about the Japanese American experience. We interviewed Brian. Of course, you can't do a project like that without Brian Niiya. I hate to tell you, but that's true. And we captured interviews with Kenji Taguma in San Francisco, and Busher, who was at the time, he was the Pacific Citizen Board Chair, who's also a media specialist in Philadelphia. So we have some really great interviews, and like I said, never before seen footage, including the 1935 Issei Week Festival with Charlie Chaplin as a guest of honor. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the plug.
And then, oh, okay. And then I wanted to show you guys something really cool that we've been working on with the Little Tokyo Historical Society. And so we've actually took there was an original publication, which was a biography written by Kenichi Sato, which was commissioned by the Kashu Mainichi, the California Daily News newspaper that Sei Fujii had founded. And we had that translated into English, edited by Naomi Hirahara. And over the past 10 years, I guess Bill can confirm how long it took. but over the past 10 years or plus 10 years, we were able to put together this wonderful publication that we'll be releasing in November. And, separate from being able to explore and like enjoy this history, I think it's what's really special, because I know that in a lot of conversations for young adults like myself, is that we want to know more about the Asian American involvement in civil rights. We want to be part of the conversation, and we don't have to feel like we didn't contribute, because we have a long-standing, over a century of contributions to helping fight for equal rights for all minorities all across the United States. And so this book, and tracing Sei Fujii's life, really tells a story of from like 1882, from the years of exclusion into the years leading up to Asian inclusion, sort of the path that an individual, a civil rights leader, could take in order to change their environment, regardless of whatever discriminatory laws. And I think it could provide some really excellent lessons for the next generation to, get to know and appreciate what's been done before them, be proud of that, but also know how to react when, we're going to be faced with more challenges, which are inevitable. So yeah, I'm really excited for this. So we'll hopefully be announcing a book launch event soon, but yeah, really cool stuff. We also went back to Japan, visited Sei Fujii's ancestral home. So met his granddaughter and everything. So yeah. So
Oh my goodness.
Images a Little Tokyo reporter. See.
That is beautiful and so inspiring, everything you said. I know that you've probably piqued the interest of many people, young people, all generations who are watching this. So I want to acknowledge a few programs here: Tadaima 2021 and Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, Little Tokyo Historical Society, participating team and planners, Marissa Kim Nakata. Thank you so much for your cues and your wonderful tech work, Haruka Rotabush. Really appreciate you. Thank you for making this so memorable. Thank you for keeping everyone's interest in this and wakening up everybody's spirits. And when you walk the streets of Little Tokyo, you can hear the echoes of the past. So thank you so much for keeping that all alive for us. So just signing off. Thank you to Brian. Thank you to Ellen, Jeffrey, Bill. You guys are fabulous. Keep up the great work.
You too. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, Denise. Can we answer a couple of these? There's a couple of quick questions that should be.
It's your show. Let's do it.
Sorry. Thank you, Denise. But maybe Brian could answer that about the outside newspapers, if there is free Japanese, or how the newspapers got approved in camp.
Sure. With regard to the newspapers in camp, as I mentioned, the Assembly Center papers were overtly censored. So they actually had to pass the content by administrators at the camp. The newspapers in the WRA concentration camps, Manzanar, Heart Mountain, and so forth, they weren't explicitly censored in that way, but the administration still had ways of kind of keeping tabs on them. And as I gave a couple of examples, they did have ways of controlling the content without kind of explicit censorship. So in terms of the papers on the outside, of course, all Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forcibly incarcerated. but there were a handful of Japanese Americans who lived outside of the West Coast, most notably in Denver, Salt Lake City, other points further east, and they were not subject to mass removal and incarceration. So the 4 newspapers I mentioned, the 2 in Denver and the 2 in Salt Lake City, were done in the free zone by Japanese Americans who were not in camp. And I think because of that, they had, I think, a particular appeal to people who were in camp, who felt like they were getting a clearer picture, or less constrained picture of what was going on from these papers on the outside. Whether that's true or not is debatable, but yeah, so there were those 4 that were published on the outside of the camps.
Were there any other questions?
So what other kind of content and community events did they cover in the newspapers during incarceration?
Yeah, because we didn't talk about Japanese sports, events like that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the papers. A lot of them, there are a page or 2 devoted to sports scores, box scores of baseball games, and so forth. A lot of social stuff. Announcements of dances and art exhibits, and just kind of small town community type stuff that you would see. And then there were also more serious announcements by the administration. There were editorials. There were kind of columnists, kind of like the newspapers today, talking about life in the camps. If you didn't know any better, if you're just seeing them without knowing the context, they really do look a lot like a typical small town newspaper of the time period. It's only when you kind of look at the context and how they were produced that things start to jump out at you of what's not covered, what's not mentioned in these papers. So, but yeah, they're, like I said, they are in Densho's archive. They are in other places as well online. So, take a look. They're pretty interesting at times.
I think once Japanese started to serve in World War II, weren't there quite a bit of interest on how they were doing during the war in these camp newspapers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That becomes a huge thing that is covered in the papers, because from the WRA's perspective, they really wanted to play up the achievements of the Nisei soldiers as a way to kind of smooth the way for Japanese Americans to return to the outside world. And of course, later in the war, the WRA's whole philosophy was to get people to leave camp as much as they can. So they really played up kind of successful adaptation of Japanese Americans who had left for places like Chicago and New York, and told kind of stories to encourage people to leave camp. So yeah, those 2 things definitely were a part of the papers towards the end of the war.
One quick question about whether there were any JA newspapers published in large eastern cities from Thomas.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
The New York Nichibei, Chicago Shimpo is still printing. New York Nichibei, up until I would say 10 years ago, they were publishing, and there's probably others, but those are the 2 that I'm aware of.
And there were a lot of other smaller ones that were kind of short-lived, but yeah, those were the 2 major ones. But yeah, there were a lot of them at one time.
You guys are encyclopedias. So I think we had a very successful night, a wonderful questions, great participation. I learned so much. So again, thank you to all of you for inspiring me, educating me, and everybody who's been watching. Thank you, Jeffrey, for turning me on to Sei Fujii.
Yay, thank you, Denise.
All right.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Denise.
everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
great night.